The whispering key. The night Linda found the key, the air was still. The faint glow of the crescent moon barely penetrated the dense fog that enveloped the old coastal town of Ravenswood. She had been out walking her dog Max, when he suddenly stopped, sniffing furiously at something buried in the damp earth near the gnarled roots of an ancient oak tree. Linda knelt to inspect what had caught Max's attention and unearthed a heavy, ornate key. Its design was intricate, almost otherworldly, with symbols etched into its surface that seemed to shift when she turned it in her hand. A shiver coursed through her as she stood, holding the key against the faint light. "Who could have lost something like this?" she murmured, brushing her auburn hair from her face. Max whimpered, tugging at his leash, his tail tucked firmly between his legs. He pulled her away, eager to leave the shadow of the oak tree. But Linda's curiosity was piqued. Something about the key felt significant, as if it had been waiting for her. She pocketed it and headed home, unaware of the dark forces she had unwittingly unleashed. Oscar had been working late at the Ravenswood Gazette when the first reports came in. The town's historic lighthouse, long abandoned, had suddenly lit up. Its beam cut through the fog, illuminating the rocky cliffs and turbulent sea. He stared at the grainy photograph a local fisherman had emailed him. "Impossible," he muttered, adjusting his glasses. "The lighthouse hasn't been operational for decades." Oscar felt a strange unease creeping over him. Ravenswood was no stranger to mysteries, but this one felt different. He grabbed his coat and headed out, the cold night air biting at his skin. The streets were eerily empty, save for the faint echo of the lighthouse's foghorn in the distance. At home, Linda couldn't stop staring at the key. She had cleaned it, revealing even more details. A serpent coiled around a tree, its eyes like tiny rubies, and what looked like runes carved along the shaft. She traced the symbols with her finger, a tingling sensation spreading through her hand. Suddenly, Max began growling at the front door. His hackles were raised, and his growls deepened into feral snarls. Linda froze. She could feel it too, a presence, cold and malevolent, just beyond the door. The doorknob rattled, as if someone was trying to get in. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. The rattling stopped. Max's growls faded into uneasy whines. Linda crept to the window and peered outside. The fog was thicker now, swirling unnaturally. Shapes moved within it, fleeting and indistinct. Clutching the key tightly, she backed away, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Oscar arrived at the lighthouse just past midnight. The beam had stopped, but the heavy iron door at its base was ajar. He hesitated, his journalist's instinct battling with his sense of self-preservation. Taking a deep breath, he stepped inside. The air was damp and smelled of salt and decay. His flashlight illuminated the spiraling staircase, its steps worn from decades of use. As he ascended, he noticed strange markings on the walls. They matched the symbols Linda had seen on the key, though Oscar had no way of knowing that. A faint hum grew louder the higher he climbed, resonating deep in his chest. When he reached the top, he found the source, a massive brass lock embedded in the wall. It pulsated with an unnatural light, the symbols on its surface glowing faintly. Oscar reached out to touch it, but stopped short, a voice echoing in his mind. The key must not be turned. Linda's night was far from over. As she tried to calm Max, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Bring the key to the lighthouse. Do not delay." Her heart raced. She didn't know how anyone could know about the key. Against her better judgment, she grabbed her coat and Max's leash. The dog resisted at first, but relented when Linda's firm tug assured him they were going somewhere safe, or so she thought. The fog seemed to guide her, thickening when she veered off course and thinning when she moved in the right direction. By the time she reached the lighthouse, her hands were shaking, and Max's leash felt like a lifeline. She saw a figure standing at the entrance, illuminated by the faint glow of the fog-shrouded moon. "Oscar," she called hesitantly. He turned, relief washing over his face when he saw her. "Linda, what are you doing here?" I found this." She held up the key. Its symbols glowed faintly in the darkness. "I got a message to bring it here." Oscar's expression darkened. "We need to destroy it." Inside the lighthouse, the air grew colder. Linda's breath fogged up as they climbed the stairs together. Max whimpered, but followed closely. When they reached the brass lock, the key in Linda's hand began to tremble, almost as if it had a will of its own. The symbols on the lock and the key pulsed in unison, their glow intensifying. "What happens if we use it?" Linda asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Oscar hesitated. I don't know, but the stories, they say this key binds something. Something that should never be free." Linda's hand moved involuntarily toward the lock. She fought it, her fingers trembling. "It's like it wants me to do it," she gasped. Oscar grabbed her wrist. "You don't have to." A deep, guttural voice echoed through the chamber, shaking the walls. "Turn the key." The fog outside thickened, pressing against the windows like a living thing. The room grew darker, the only light coming from the glowing symbols. Max barked furiously, his teeth bared at the lock. "We need to leave," Oscar said, pulling Linda back. But it was too late. The key slipped from her grasp, hovering in the air before slotting itself into the lock. The tumblers clicked, and the lighthouse shook violently. A deafening roar filled the air as the lock burst open, releasing a blinding light that engulfed everything. When Linda awoke, the lighthouse was gone. She and Oscar lay on the rocky shore, the tide lapping at their feet. Max stood nearby, his fur bristling as he growled at the sea. "What happened?" Linda whispered, sitting up. Oscar stared at the horizon, where the fog had lifted, revealing a dark silhouette rising from the water. It was massive, its form shifting and incomprehensible. The air vibrated with its presence. We let it out," Oscar said, his voice hollow. "God help us." The thing in the distance turned, its countless eyes locking onto them. And then, it began to move.
The Secrets of Ravenswood Motel. The rain fell in relentless sheets, turning the lonely highway into a shimmering ribbon of water, under the dim glow of flickering streetlights. Emma Grayson squinted through the windshield of her battered sedan, the wipers struggling against the downpour. She had been driving for hours, her GPS giving up miles ago, leaving her hopelessly lost in the middle of nowhere. A sign loomed ahead, its letters barely legible through the rain. Ravenswood Motel vacancy. The building sat in eerie isolation, its weathered facade illuminated by a flickering neon sign that cast strange shadows on the puddled ground. Desperation outweighed hesitation, and Emma pulled into the gravel lot. As she stepped out of the car, the chill of the rain pierced her thin jacket. She hurried toward the office, where a single light burned weakly. The bell above the door jingled as she entered. Inside, the air was heavy, carrying a scent of mildew and something metallic. Behind the desk stood a man, his pale, sharp features accentuated by the dim lighting. His name tag read, Caleb. "Welcome to Ravenswood Motel," he said with a voice that was both warm and unsettling. His eyes seemed to linger on Emma a moment too long. "Looking for a room?" "Yes, please," she replied, shivering slightly. "Just for the night." He slid a ledger across the desk. As Emma scrawled her name, Caleb's gaze never wavered. "Room 7, he said, handing her a key attached to an old worn tag. "Enjoy your stay." Emma's room was stark, the bare minimum of comfort. The bed creaked under her as she sat down, her wet shoes leaving muddy prints on the threadbare carpet. The walls seemed to close in, their floral wallpaper peeling at the edges. Yet, exhaustion overtook unease, and she sank into the lumpy mattress, letting sleep claim her. She woke hours later to a sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping. Her heart pounded as she strained to identify it. The noise seemed to come from the wall behind her. Gathering courage, Emma pressed her ear against the wallpaper. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, whispering voice. The words were indecipherable, but they sent chills racing down her spine. Suddenly, the whispers ceased. Emma backed away, her breath shallow. The room was silent, save for the rain outside. Telling herself it was just her imagination, she climbed back into bed, though sleep did not come easily. The next morning, Emma went to the office to ask Caleb about the noise, but the desk was empty. A door behind the counter stood ajar, revealing a dimly lit room filled with old dusty furniture and a stack of yellowing newspapers. Curiosity gnawed at her, and she stepped inside. The headlines on the papers screamed tales of disappearances and deaths, all tied to Ravenswood Motel. One article caught her eye. Local woman vanishes, last seen at Ravenswood. The photo was grainy, but the woman's face was unmistakable. It was the same woman whose portrait hung in the hallway near Emma's room. A floorboard creaked behind her. Emma spun around to find Caleb standing in the doorway, his face devoid of its previous warmth. "Guests aren't allowed back here," he said, his tone sharp. I was just looking for you," Emma stammered, clutching the newspaper. "What happened to these people?" Caleb's smile returned, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Old stories," he said dismissively. "Nothing to worry about." But Emma couldn't shake the unease that clung to her as she retreated to her room. That night, the tapping returned, louder and more insistent. Emma bolted upright, her heart racing. This time she followed the sound to its source, a loose panel in the wall. With trembling hands, she pried it open, revealing a small, dark space. Inside was a box, its contents hidden under a layer of dust. Emma opened the box to find a collection of photographs. Each one featured a different woman, all posing in front of the motel. Her stomach churned as she recognized the woman from the newspaper, as well as others whose faces seemed eerily familiar. Beneath the photos was a bundle of letters, their ink faded but still legible. The letters painted a chilling picture. They spoke of Caleb's obsession with the women, his attempts to keep them at the motel forever. The final letter ended abruptly, its last words smeared as though the writer had been interrupted. A noise behind her made Emma freeze. She turned to see Caleb standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You shouldn't have done that," he said, his voice low and dangerous. Emma backed away, clutching the box. "What is this, Caleb? What happened to these women?" "They're still here," he said, stepping closer. "They'll always be here." Panic surged through Emma. She darted past Caleb, bolting out of the room and into the rain. The gravel crunched under her feet as she raced toward her car, the box clutched tightly to her chest. But when she reached the lot, her car was gone. "You can't leave," Caleb called from the doorway. "No one ever leaves." Emma's scream was swallowed by the storm. The next morning the rain had stopped. A new guest arrived at Ravenswood Motel, greeted by Caleb's familiar smile. In room 7, a new portrait hung on the wall, a photograph of Emma, her expression frozen in fear. The cycle continued. Ravenswood Motel kept its secrets, and Caleb ensured they were never discovered.